It's downstairs.
All right, so we're going to get started here in a couple of minutes. So one thing, I'm going to go ahead and pass around. Obviously, you don't have to do this right now, but this is the sign-up sheet if you intend to take the midterm. Okay. So I've blocked out basically Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of next week with starting at 6 o'clock in the morning and finishing at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You have 2-hour blocks. So if you are planning on taking it, go ahead and sign up. If you don't know, because obviously you're waiting to see how your quiz grade turns out today, then feel free to wait and sign up later. All right, so let's jump in. All right, so the reading today was all about what? Cap rates. Okay, do you feel like you have read more than you could possibly stomach on cap rates? Yes or no? Okay, hopefully you have a better understanding of what cap rates are after having gone through that. Now, let's just start off, once again, kind of review some of the basics, calculations, that sort of thing, kind of make sure you're on point. As you guys covered the very first day of class, the simple formula as it relates to valuation and cap rates is REE, okay? And here, income is typically your annual net operating income, usually is stabilized net operating income. Down here, obviously, is your cap rate or rate of return. And here is the value of the property. Once again, could be investment value, could be market value. And one of the points that I want to make sure that I make is a lot of times these terms can be used very loosely, okay, in terms of how people specifically define these terms and what they actually mean in practice. And what I mean by that is let's just start off with the income piece, okay? Now, based upon your reading, how many different ways might we be able to measure out what that income is, okay? Sometimes it's just referred to as just NOI. But what else? What other words, adjectives, or other words did you see attached to NOI?
Value. Before cash, or before tax?
No.
Multiple?
No. 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 Well, possibly. No. Okay. You hopefully saw stabilized NOI. All right? And hopefully you also saw sort of cash flow, like adjusted NOI. You may, see even other sort of forms of NOI, but all of these are going to be, for our purposes, annual. Okay? Whoops, you will spell. All right? So if you're given a monthly number, you need to do what? Multiply by 12 to get an annual number. Okay? Now, what would you say is the difference between NOI and, let's just say, stabilized NOI?
It's variable.
Sorry?
One's variable, one's stable.
Okay, one is variable, but what does that mean to be variable? I mean, what are we saying? Okay, it's changing. Why is it changing? Okay, maybe you've got occupancy that's increasing or potentially decreasing. Okay, maybe you've got some random expenses that are not necessarily long-term and sustainable. So to say that this past year's NOI you know, is going to be absolutely indicative of this year's NOI or next year's NOI. It may not be the case because there could be unusual sort of circumstances that, you know, you want to potentially adjust for. So this is where then we come up with this term, sort of stabilized NOI, which simply implies, okay, some sort of normal operating procedure with the property, okay? That you don't have any high highs, you don't have any low lows, everything's just kind of running pretty smoothly. You've got a stable occupancy rate, stable, you know, expenses, you know, so everything is just normal, okay? And so that is the number that almost always, whenever you're doing an investment analysis, you're going to really want to focus on, all right? Now, another term that's sort of thrown out here in this particular text is called sort of a cash flow adjusted NOI. What were they talking about here? This will be for my A students, will prove that they're legitimately A students because they read it.
You get different cash flows at different times?
No. Or at least not that basic. I mean, yes, but no.
Evaluating a property based on what the income could be because it's underperforming?
No.
Taxes?
No.
Could it have to do with, for example, you may make money on the books, but it has more to do with what like your cash status is at the NOI. So if you have like depreciation, all these expenses that may decrease, it's not calculating that.
Okay, it's not necessarily depreciation, but it is specifically adjusting for reserves and adjusting for capital expenditures, adjusting for leasing commissions, adjusting for sort of unusual circumstances but they affect the cash flow on the property. So in other words, your NOI would be a higher number than basically your cash flow adjusted NOI, all right, always. Because the cash flow adjusted is going to subtract out these sort of reserves, like a reserve for replacement for repairs, a reserve for replacement for, you know, maintenance, any sort of expected capital expenditure that you're going to have associated with a property, you potentially are going to sort of subtract that out. Now, why might you do that? If you're an investor, if you're an owner,
To get a more accurate description of what you're actually cash flowing and what's like spendable to investors or developers.
Free cash
Very
flow?
simply put, yes. Because this might be inflated, especially, let's assume that you buy a property and it's got tons of deferred maintenance, okay? That you've got to go in probably relatively soon after you buy the property, do a fair number of repairs and maintenance to the property to get the property in truly good working order, or to reposition the property to basically be a higher quality property generating higher rents. So in order to do that, you're going to have to obviously spend some money in terms of capital expenditures and so forth. And as a result, that is automatically going to reduce whatever your net operating income is down to a lower level. So from an investment point of view, to make apples to apples comparison, whenever you're looking at those kind of distressed properties, you're probably going to want to look at, okay, kind of your almost worst case scenario as it relates to that cash flow the property would actually be generating, the real dollars that you would have available to you after you had made sort of allowances for those reserves and expenditures. Okay, does that make sense? Because they're not normal operating expenses. That's not what we're subtracting out. What we're subtracting out are things like capital expenditures and reserves, okay? Because those are not deemed to be operating expenses. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? All right. So you could, let's just say, you could have a property that could have an operating income this past year of, let's say, $125,000. You could have a property with a stabilized NOI of maybe, you know, I don't know, $100,000, and a cash flow adjusted NOI of, let's say, $75,000. All right? Each of those would then give you a very different answer or a very different value for, in essence, the same property. You follow me? Okay, so if we kind of go in over here and we say that we're trying to solve for value, okay, and so that is going to be net operating income divided by the cap rate. So in this case, we start out with 125,000, and we say that our cap rate is, I don't know, let's just say 5%. Let's see what that does for us. $2.5 million? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Versus taking, let's say, the stabilized NOI, using that same cap rate here for a second. Gives us the value of $2 million for the property. Okay. And then using, let's say, the value or the net operating income, the cash flow adjusted net operating income of 75,000. Okay. Cool.
I was looking at basically a spreadsheet of a property that I was underwriting 31 units, and last year's NOI was like 308,000, and then this year, obviously, it's only been, it hasn't been the full year. So would you evaluate the property strictly on last year's?
You can do it one of two ways, at least one of two ways. You could just do the trailing 12 months and just say, okay, it's kind of work backwards 12 months if you have monthly cash flows. If you don't have monthly cash flows, then you can't really do that. But what you could do is you could then say, okay, what has been the average per month for year to date, and then calculate an average per month and multiply that by 12 to come up with an estimated annual.
Okay, yeah, because they were doing it by literally like the 9, and then it was inflating the price.
Right.
So he was pretty unreasonable at this price to begin with. So.
Yeah. I mean, all you're really trying to do is, at the end of the day, you're trying to get some sort of a reasonable expectation of what that income number is, okay? Because what you're really saying as an investor is that is the dollar amount that, at least in a pure cash transaction, that you're going to walk away with on an annual basis. So you would hope that that number then would kind of give you that ballpark idea of, well, what kind of rate of return am I going to generate on whatever dollar amount that I'm investing. So over here, you're sort of saying, if you're willing to accept a 5% rate of return on this property, then depending on which sort of NOI you use, that value could be anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 million, which is obviously a pretty big difference. And so you've got to really say, well, what are you really trying to articulate? What are you really trying to achieve with these numbers? And most investors are simply looking at, what is that free cash flow? What is the dollar amount that I'm going to be able to literally stick in my back pocket and walk away with at the end of the year? And normally, that's probably going to be this number, but as a matter of practice, in terms of what we probably tend to do in those calculations, we tend to use this number. Okay, this is just a more conservative number. Okay, yep.
Can you explain the ERB calculation, just in terms of like how to look at that and how to read that? Because I'm not sure everyone understands, just looking at that little circular thing, that it is value equals NOI or cap rate.
Okay, so real simple, the way that you think about ERB is that if you're going to be solving, let's say, for the value, okay, you put your hand over the value, income divided by cap rate, okay? If you're solving for the cap rate, put your hand over it, income divided by value. If you're solving for the annual NOI, cap rate times value. Okay, so it's just a simple memory device to kind of, sort of keep in perspective what the relationship is between those three variables. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Now, another way you could potentially kind of begin to manipulate this, and I don't want to get too crazy with this, but you could make the argument, all right, should we really be using the same cap rate for each of these three different types of values? You follow what I'm saying? In other words, you could be saying, all right, that this maybe should be a lower cap rate than this should maybe be a higher cap rate than this, and then ultimately through those adjustments, you end up sort of centralizing around a number with a lower band of difference instead of, so for example, what I'm trying to say is, let's say that we were to change this one, I don't know, to 4%. Let's just see what happens. Okay, then this goes up to 1,875,000. Let's say we change this to 6%. This goes down 2,083,333. Okay, just from a relatively minor 1% adjustment. Now, some people say that's not so minor, but in this case, it's really, these percentages, we're saying, yeah, with that 1% difference, that basically is compressing our range of values from 1.875 million to 2.08 million. Okay, does that make sense? So you're saying, well, why would you do that? Well, you might be saying that this one, because it's such a high number, it needs a higher level of discounting. In other words, that we need to shave off more of that income to come up with a more realistic indicator of value. Okay? Whereas down here on the bottom end, we're sort of saying, well, this is a super conservative number, so we might want to adjust it upward in terms of the value, or in other words, say that we don't need as much of a haircut off of that number because we've already, in essence, adjusted it for basically those extra sort of expenditures. Does that make sense? Now you're saying, well, that seems like an awful lot of just sort of reaching up and grabbing stuff out of the sky and throwing it, to a certain extent, yes, but what you're normally going to do in practice is you're going to look at other properties that have sold that are somewhat similar to the property that you're trying to evaluate, and you're going to see what that relationship is between their annual net operating income and their value, and come up with what that appropriate sort of cap rate is. This is where the more complete information that you have about property level performance for competing properties helps to make your assessment of what the value should be that much more accurate. Does that make sense? Because usually whenever you're going to buy a commercial property, they put out there instantly, NOI is X, and now what you need to do is hopefully grab a hold of their operating statements if they're available, and they would be upon a serious interest in purchasing or being able to probably get them from an appraiser. But ultimately, then beginning to see, are they being reasonable? Are they being accurate? Are they being kind of crazy with what their calculations are as it relates to getting down to that NOI number? Okay, because if you remember, to get down to NOI, we're starting up here with potential gross income, we're subtracting out vacancy and collection losses, we're adding in other income, that gives us effective gross income, we're subtracting out total operating expenses to get us down to NOI. Now, so a lot can potentially be manipulated, in that process. They could be overly inflating their income numbers, you know, in terms of what their rent rates are, okay? Now, one of the probably most common and, I'm trying to think the right word to use, deceptive sort of practices that in many cases gets used here in terms of the potential gross income calculation is especially on apartment or housing rentals. Because what will happen in a lot of cases, you'll have owners of these rental residential properties that will do what? They'll give away free rent at the beginning of a lease. And so what they might do is they'll say, you know what, John, we're going to do a 15-month lease, but I'm going to give you the first 3 months free, and then I'm going to start charging you rent in essence, you know, and starting really in that 4th month all the way out to the 15th month, okay? But then what they'll do is they'll in essence sort of show the lease really being 12 months at potentially, you know, that higher sort of rate and not really sort of showing that 3 months that was given away for free. Does that make sense?
Would it be better if they like straight lined averaged it and said that over the 15 months this is what they paid?
Well, okay, there's a reason why they do this, and yes, but here's what I'm trying to maybe illustrate just with that particular issue. All right, so let's say, I don't know, the market rent should be $1,000 a month. But what they're doing is they're saying, all right, and so we'll just start with this, keep this simple. $1,000 a month times 12 would be $12,000 a year, okay, per unit, let's say. All right, but what they're in essence doing is they're saying, all right, we're in essence going to give you 3 months for free, and it's going to be at, but it's also going to be at maybe $1,000 a month, but so you're still going to have the $12,000, but it's really over 15 months. So the real income being generated by that per month would be $800 a month. And so what they're in essence going to do to John, they're going to say, hey, look, we're giving you really 3 months free rent, but you know, here's how we're going to do it. We're really not going to give you that 3 months free. What we're going to do is we're going to simply say your rent rate is maybe $800 a month, you know, but we're really giving you a discount, you know, up front. But then whenever they do the accounting for it, they're really going to say it's the full 1,000. Okay, totally deceptive, totally wrong, totally, you know. But it's an issue of how they go about recording it, how they go about, you know, in essence, you know, sort of trying to inflate those numbers for a prospective purchaser that may not really know what they're looking at whenever they potentially see those leases, because what they may be seeing is the property is generating really effectively $1,000 a month, okay, when in reality it's really not, okay? All right, vacancy and collection losses. Same general sort of thought there. You could have, you know, a situation of where that once again, because of pre-rent and because of other things that are being done, are they artificially sort of inflating or deflating what that number is? Now the other income is really where it gets interesting, at least from my perspective. Because let's say that you've got something that's truly unique to your property, but that's not tied to the property, that you're generating other income from. Probably the best example I can think of is, let's say you're generating a ton of money off of a cleaning service, okay? Or a dog walking service, or a food delivery service, or, you know, God only knows what else you could be running out of that particular complex. And that could be really boosting up dramatically the other income number, which would potentially then ultimately inflate the net operating income. Now, you're still going to have associated operating expenses you know, with that income. But the point being is that's really not legitimate rental income off of the property. And so what happens in practice, that if you're really doing your job evaluating a property and you see another income line and it's not really tied to something very specific like parking or, you know, laundry fees or something like that, and it's more tied to some other weird services being offered, you're pretty much just going to strike through it and say, you know, we probably shouldn't count this. Okay? Do you have a question, Kenny?
No, no.
Okay.
Shouldn't that be like disclosed though? Like, it would be like the difference between economic occupancy and physical for like the top one?
It should be, but here's the thing. There's such a lack of absolute standardization in terms of how this information sometimes gets presented. I mean, all you really have to do is to say, okay, you know, gather up a whole bunch of operating statements from, you know, different properties, and every one of them will look a little bit different. Every one of them will call something, you know, one of these line items something slightly different, or potentially try to reposition it into a different category, or try to, you know, I mean, it's the sort of thing you really have to understand what all of those sources of revenue are, what all those sources of expenses are, and to be able to sort of haircut it to a point of where you hopefully are getting a legitimate, reliable sort of bottom line number.
So for like institutional things, like big buildings, is that part of the broker's job, is to like underwrite the financials that they're getting so that when they're presenting it to people that it's legitimate and they're not just like, you know, giving out whatever the...
Yeah, because there could be all sorts of things, and some, especially with this other income line, there could be things that are carved out of that. Like, for example, one that I remember very vividly was there was a property where it was a gas station, but the gas station had this little extra parcel of land adjacent to it where a billboard had been erected. Well, the owner of the property was getting, you know, whatever it was, like $500 a month or $1,000 a month, whatever it was, off of the rental from the billboard. Well, whenever they sold the property, they put, you know, excluding, you know, income from the billboard or whatever, but yet they still included it as, you know, income the property was generating to, in essence, inflate the NOI.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's stuff, simple stuff like that, or like with big, you know, massive, you know, skyscraper sort of buildings, there may be all kinds of like sub-rentals and towers and, you know, cell phone towers and other things that are potentially, you know, giving rental income, and those may be carved out of the sale agreement.
So would you define, I guess, alternative other income as anything you're getting as commission?
It's not necessarily commission, it's just
parking.
other income that the property as a whole, in some way or another, is generating.
Like vending machines, parking.
Those are going to be the normal ones.
Yeah.
Okay? But there are going to be other that are going to be abnormal that really aren't, once again, going to be automatically, physically tied to the property. That, you know, as I said, you could be running a dog walking service or a, you know, catering service or whatever out of the property, but yet, you know, whenever you leave, all of those services go away, or all that income goes away. All I'm saying is just be aware of other income, okay? Because it's one of those things that can really blow up and potentially be problematic for folks. Okay, we scoot on down to operating expenses. And here, same sort of thing. You know, one of the things that's quite common is whenever you have an owner that has, let's say, multiple properties, how do they go about appropriately allocating management expense across those properties? Okay, so let's say I own 10 different Starbucks locations, all right? How do I, as the owner of those properties, allocate my cost, you know, as the owner, manager, whatever, across all of those? Do I say, okay, it's going to be equal per location? Do I say it's going to be based on sales? Do I say I'm just going to allocate my cost to the ones that I plan on never selling? Therefore, the ones that I plan to sell, I'm not going to allocate any management expense to? I mean, you know, there's a whole variety of ways one could do that to either inflate or deflate the actual expenses associated with that particular property. Does that make sense? Okay? And that's quite common, you know, to have that kind of situation, or even like with supplies. You know, think about it like this. Once again, I've got 10 different locations, but yet what I do is I have all the supplies for all 10 Starbucks shipped to one address. And I allocate all of my cost of goods to that one address. Well, what's it going to do? It's going to make that one address look really, really bad, but then, you know, all the others potentially look really, really good. Okay, I'm using extreme examples just so that you understand the concept. Okay, I'm not saying any of that is appropriate or correct or right. What I'm saying is those sorts of things happen. Other things in terms of the operating expense that, you know, once again can influence the NOI is how extreme I am with my repairs and maintenance. Okay, am I the landlord that every time a light bulb goes out, I'm in there fixing it? Every time, you know, a singular piece of carpet needs to be trimmed, I'm out there trimming it. Every time there's a stain, I'm cleaning it. Every time, you know, there's any little minor thing, I'm taking care of it right then, right there, you know, immediately. Plus, on top of that, I'm replacing things well before they need to be replaced. That maybe that, well, I don't know, just like take a refrigerator. Maybe a refrigerator normally is going to have a life of 10 years, okay? But yet maybe I make the assumption, I want to be the landlord where a refrigerator never goes out, so after 5 years, I'm automatically going to replace every single refrigerator, okay? I'm using this to sort of illustrate on one end of the spectrum, you have that kind of landlord, okay? On the other end of the spectrum, you have really the super slumlord, okay? The one that in essence doesn't matter, you know, everything breaks, never fixes it. If they do, it takes forever for it to be fixed, and they do the absolute positive minimum that has to be done to maybe, you know, keep the property in working order and to keep the tenants potentially from moving out, okay? Those are two very extreme positions. Well, taking that, would you not expect that that could manipulate dramatically the operating expenses on a property, okay? Especially if you're getting ready to sell the property. Because if you're getting ready to sell the property, you're probably going to be in the mindset, I don't want to spend any more than I have to on this property this year because I want to do what? Minimize my operating expenses so that when I do go to sell it, my NOI is as high as possible. Does that make sense? Now, but having just said that, what I've said sort of violates this whole thing of stabilized NOI, because by really not doing the operating expenses I should have been doing, you're not really getting a true reflection of what the NOI should be. You're getting basically a manipulated, basically, valuation. Yeah?
So, obviously, we're talking about how the NOI can be manipulated beforehand from the seller. What exactly would you do to try to minimize the risk of that happening?
Well, it's not that you can minimize the risk of it happening. What you can do is understand you can understand if it is happening by taking a good, solid look at the property. You know, maybe even interviewing tenants if you need to, or whatever. I mean, you know, it's not an absolute precise science. It's more of your intuition of just sort of saying, how many bad, terrible, awful things could a property owner do that I just need to be aware of, that whenever I'm buying the property, I don't get stuck with a bad situation. Much the same way, I mean, you know, if you're buying a used car, what would you want to do? You would want to have inspections done, you would want to, you know, make sure that the tires are good, that the engine is good, you know, all of, you know, it hasn't been maybe repainted, hasn't been an accident, you know, all those sorts of things. Well, the same sort of due diligence, you know, is true on buying a property. You know, you would want to really peel back and try to understand what are all the different things I need to be kind of just thinking about whenever I go and inspect a property. So you're not just kind of like looking around casually, you're sort of saying, okay, is there something here that I need to potentially, you know, investigate a little bit further? I don't know, just something basic that, you know, you walk into a residential property and you see some little black spots, you know, on the wall or on the ceiling around the vents, and you say, "Ooh, what is that? Is that black mold? You know, is that something that potentially, you know, we've got some sort of problem that's gonna, you know, that maybe has been painted over and hasn't really been fixed? You know, do I need to, you know, investigate that a little bit more? You know, that sort of thing."
Are you asking for like bank statements and stuff and like?
Potentially, yes. You know, on these properties, you would want to have, you know, a full and complete set of operating statements, you know, at least for the past couple of years if it's been in operation for that, you know, length of time or more. In some cases, just really as long as they have the operating history on the property. You know?
Some of these sellers don't know though, like they truly don't, I have no idea.
And I believe that, especially on smaller properties. And in those cases, it is a leap of faith. That, you know, you're just sort of going, that's part of the reason why there's sometimes a much higher rate of return on those kind of properties, because you are taking a bigger leap of faith than you are with, excuse me, a much more established, you know, Class A sort of property that maybe has, you know, 20 years of operating history, and every single expense, every single piece of income they've ever had is 100% documented, and you can sort of feel good that it's got the kind of almost, you know, good housekeeping seal of approval sort of thing. Okay? Make sense? All right. Other thoughts, questions, observations? Yep.
Would people use like smaller rental properties use like QuickBooks?
Yeah.
To keep track of that type of stuff?
And even if they even go to that extreme, I mean, that's the thing, you know, with smaller properties and owners, some of them don't keep really books at all. I mean, it's almost just like cash in, cash out, okay? I get $5,000 a month in rent, I put that in my bank account, okay, I've got some expenses I need to pay in terms of my mortgage, my property taxes, my insurance, whatever. I write those checks, and, you know, whatever I have left over, well, that's what I have left over.
That's a lazy way of doing it. Right?
Yeah, but, and sometimes that works just fine.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you know, you may not then be able to take full advantage of all the tax write-offs that you would be potentially entitled to if you don't keep books or keep sloppy books or whatever it might be.
How would you approach a situation like that? Would you allocate a market cap rate, or?
Well, you in essence, you probably say, okay, look, if you don't really have any sort of operating history at all for the property, and you're wanting to buy the property, then you're probably just going to say that I'm going to demand a higher rate of return, a higher cap rate for that kind of property, because it's got potentially higher risk. Because you're sort of, it's the fear of the unknown of, you know, what are they really trying to hide? Or is there something that's being hidden? Because you don't really know.
So a market cap rate is not required for something like that?
It may be a higher than market cap rate.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the point. That it's because it's higher risk level than the overall market.
So what are you asking for personally? If you found a good opportunity, a unit, and they have no books, what are you saying? Like, I want to see this. What is that?
With absolute minimum, you would want to know what the property, what leases you're obligated to. You know, are you able, like upon taking possession of the property, are you able to kick out the tenants, or are you stuck with them for a certain period of time? So at a minimum, that's probably the very first thing you'd want to know, because, you know, what if that property owner just signed a 3-year lease or something with the tenants at a below market, you know, rental rate,
Yeah.
You're stuck with that tenant for the next 3 years, well, you're potentially screwed, you know. I would want to, you know, see to what extent, you know, the payment history, you know, for the tenants. You know, once again, if it's not really inherently available, that may be a little worried. But, you know, just to know, are they paying? Are they paying on time? You know, I want to see all the utility bills, what they currently are, and some sort of, you know, history on that. Obviously, take a look at, you know, what the property taxes are. I would want to make sure that there's no sort of liens against the property for any sort of work that's been done by.
Also just for like the expense aspect. So you're asking for like bills, and then like what specifically you want, what paperwork you want from them.
I want everything they can give me. Now, I may not be able to get everything, and that's my point, that with every single one of these transactions, it's going to be different. You know, that's what I'm saying. There's almost no standardization as to what, you know, you can almost expect. I mean, I've had buyers that I have bought, or sellers that I have bought things from that I've had very little to go off of. But then my thought process was, I'm buying it so far below replacement cost, I don't really have to worry about that. You know, And then other situations of where, well, I pass on a deal because, you know, something about the property makes me worried that there's, you know, an issue there. Like, for example, I had one instance of where, you know, somebody was getting a divorce and the divorce wasn't finalized, and you know, there were liens on the property from the other person, you know, and it was just like, I don't want to get involved in that, at least until it's finalized.
So the more documentation you have, the closer you are to the market cap rate?
Yeah, I suppose it's a fair statement. I don't know, it's just the more document. All I'm trying to say is, yes, you want as much information as you can possibly get. You want to be able to go through that information and to try to determine what the appropriate risk level is. Simple as that. There's no absolute hard, fast science on that. If I have this, my cap rate's going to be that much higher. If I don't have that, it's going to be that much lower. It's not like that. It's more of just, you're going to have to kind of take all those things in tandem. Yep.
When you buy below replacement cost, do you insure up to replacement cost?
At a minimum, yeah.
Okay.
And in more cases than not, yes, you definitely would want to insure up to the replacement cost, the actual replacement cost.
But you also said more than that.
Or potentially more than that, depending on if there are going to be improvements that you are going to be making that might exceed what your investment is beyond the replacement cost. Like, for example, let's say replacement cost is $100,000, but you buy it at $80,000, but yet you're planning on putting in $30,000 worth of improvements, which would make your total investment $110,000. Okay, so you would want to obviously insure up to $110,000. Okay. All right, moving forward. Okay, so as it relates, we're bringing up the whole idea of replacement cost. So let's say that we've got a property that has a net operating income of, I don't know, $50,000 a year. And let's say the value, or in this case, the purchase price value, was $750,000. And so that would mean that our cap rate, or implied cap rate for this, is going to be 50,000 divided by 750,000, or basically 0.067, or 6.7%. Okay, does that make sense? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, now, let's say that this property actually has a replacement value or replacement cost well, we
Wait.
bought it at 700.
I'm so sorry. 50,000
Yeah,
divided by 750,000.
is that not 0.067?
No, it is. For I don't know. I just did it wrong, but it was not that. That's not good.
Okay. All right. So we bought it for 750,000, but let's say that the actual replacement cost is $1 million. Now, what do we mean by replacement cost? We mean, okay, we bought it for 750. That's what we paid for it. But replacement cost would mean, all right, we bought the raw land and we built an equivalent building, you know, after depreciation and so forth, so on, but the value is really $1 million. Now you're saying, well, how are you, or how is anyone acquiring anything below replacement cost? Well, there's a whole variety of explanations as to how and why that could happen. You could have a situation of where the seller doesn't really know what the value is. They're just an uninformed seller, okay? Which is very possible. Another instance is where you have a distressed seller, okay? Where they're desperate to sell the property, get out of it, get away from it, because they've got other issues and problems, whether it be divorces, bankruptcies, you know, whatever else, or, you know, deaths in the family. Maybe this is a property from someone that has died, and so their kids are just, or the folks that are inheriting the asset, you know, are just trying to get rid of it. So there's a lot of different reasons why you may be able to acquire it below what the actual replacement cost is. Okay, does everybody understand that? Now, let's say though that, in this particular case, we would want to potentially, that if someone else in the marketplace were to potentially want to be competing with us, maybe with another property, okay? Because we're sort of saying this replacement cost would be inclusive of buying land, building an equivalent building. Okay, you follow me? All right, so let's say I bought this property at $750, but yet, Cole here finds a piece of raw dirt across the street, builds the identical same building to me. His cost basis is going to be the full $1 million. Does everybody follow that? All right, well, assuming that Cole wants to get the same sort of rate of return that I'm getting in terms of the cap rate that I'm receiving, what would his NOI need to be?
Higher than ours.
Okay, that is a true statement. Okay, how much higher? Okay, so in this case, we would take the 1 million, multiply it by the cap rate of the 0.06667, whatever, and you're going to get, let's just say, roughly $66,667. Okay, do I follow that? Yes or no? Okay, now, if I were to pose, sort of a question or a scenario to you, well, how much would they have to raise the rent? From, to go from 50 to 66,000, what sort of percentage increase in NOI would that be? You know how to calculate percents.
So
So in essence, all you would do is take like the 66,667,
Right.
subtract out the 50,000. That's going to leave you with what? 16,667. And you're going to do what? Divide by 50, which is going to give you,
33%,
okay, let's double check.
I think.
33%.
How do you get the 66,000 again?
So, okay. Basically, yes, 33%, or you could say that the 66,000 is 133%,
Minus 1.
okay?
Right, I was gonna say, it might, I don't know.
Greater.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like necessary. I know that's like the longhand, but can't you also just do
Yeah.
66
Divided by 50. That's what I'm saying, and you get 1.33.
Yeah, okay.
But in essence, you're sort of saying it's 1 plus
Right.
33, or basically.
So that's if you don't want to count that little whole one number.
Right.
Gotcha.
And then quick question on, when you're calculating the NOI on the replacement cost,
Plus,
you're using the number that you got originally from you're not using 6.7, correct? You're using the number that came from 50.
Yeah, we were just sort of saying that assume that you want to maintain the same return.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, for example, on this question, we didn't take 6.7, we took the 6.6666.
Yeah. Rounding is not going to be a
Rounding,
problem.
okay.
Okay.
So you
Sorry,
want to see 33% or the
I'm sorry,
1.33, or you want to see 33%?
Either one would be fine.
Okay.
But if I just simply asked, what is the percentage increase of the NOI, the answer would be legitimately 33%. Okay? James?
How'd you get the 66,670?
Well, that's actually, if you take the 50,000 divided by 750,000, I just didn't carry all the decimal places out.
Okay.
I mean,
right.
so 50,000 divided by 750,000, the actual precise number is 0.6666667.
So we multiply that to 1 million, that would be this.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious on how the rounding is working for the quizzes.
Don't worry so much about the rounding. The rounding is not going to be what makes the answer right or wrong in most instances, okay? It's only going to be in those really rare circumstances where the rounding is really going to be the, you know, that much of a difference in the scheme of things. I don't know whether you're doing it right or wrong, okay?
Can you repeat the last question you asked to that problem?
Okay, so all I was saying was, what is, or what would need to be the increase in your NOI or your rental income to be able to maintain the same overall return or cap rate, assuming that you paid the $1 million replacement cost?
Thank you.
Okay? All right, moving forward. All right, so if you recall from one of our previous discussions, when we start breaking down the cap rate, we sort of say the cap rate is equal to the discount rate minus the growth rate. Remember that for the rest of the first day of class, okay? All right, so in this particular case, on the property, let's say that our discount rate is, I don't know, let's say 7%. And the growth rate is 1%. Then that would mean that our cap rate would be 6%. Okay? Now, the discount rate, taking it and blowing it apart a little bit, the discount rate is going to be predominantly comprised of two things. The risk-free rate plus the risk premium. Okay, so let's start with the risk-free rate and what that typically implies. Yep.
So basically, discount rate minus growth rate equals cap rate.
Right.
Okay. So now this arrow down here means.
This is simply saying our discount rate is comprised of the risk-free rate plus the risk premium.
So that's how we come up with this.
Yes. In other words, adding those two together gives us our discount rate. Okay. Now,
That's your version of the CAP-M model.
we're getting there.
Sorry.
Okay. So, in this case, the risk-free rate typically in real estate and, you know, in general, this is going to be based upon some sort of risk-free government security, okay? Could be like treasury bills, treasury bonds, you know, that's some form of what is believed to be a risk-free thing that you can invest in, okay? That, in other words, you're guaranteed to get paid back, you know, with hard, cold dollars for that particular investment. So let's just say that the risk-free rate is 2%. We can get that off of government securities, all right? Now, if our discount rate is 7%, what does that mean that our risk premium is?
5%.
5%. Okay? Now, so that 5%, where do we get that number? Where do we get that risk premium?
You just took we already have the discount rate, so you just subtract.
Well, no. Assuming you didn't have any of these other things. Assuming we were starting with all we had was the risk-free rate. Where would you come up with the risk premium?
The bank?
I'm sorry?
Was part of it the weighted average cost of cap?
Well, we're kind of getting there. Don't confuse things just yet, okay? So the risk premium, in essence, is going to be for this particular property, what is unique about this particular property, this particular asset, that says it's that much more risky than kind of the risk-free rate? How much of a premium, how much more of a rate of return do we need to generate off of this particular property, this particular asset, to make us feel good about investing in that asset, that we're being adequately and properly rewarded for our time, money, investment, all of that? Does that make sense? Now, this risk premium can be exceedingly subjective, okay? And also different for every single player in the market, because part of this is based on perception, okay? And what do you understand about perception? Perception is unique to each individual. And I think I gave the example previously of where, you know, let's say that I'm intimately familiar with a particular, you know, sub-market in a city. I know every single player, every single transaction, you know, that occurs there. Nothing occurs there that I don't know about, okay? Versus, you know, Kenny back there, you know, he's never been to that area of town, knows nothing about it, has no clue other than what he could potentially, you know, see, you know, in a newspaper or, you know, on a spreadsheet, okay? But knows nothing about it. I would expect that I would probably have a substantially lower risk premium than Kenny would for properties located within that market. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So now how I individually come up with that risk premium is somewhat maybe unique to me. It could be based upon my cost of capital, could be based upon just, you know, total random nonsense. It could just, you know, be the case that I'm just simply saying, I want a 5% risk premium on whatever it is I'm buying, and that's my number. Doesn't really matter about anything else, you know. So, but if you're trying to maybe come up with it legitimately, what you would probably do is to try to take a look at, well, what have properties been trading at in this market with the market cap rate, and then kind of back into then what that number would be. And that's where we kind of get back to your point that, okay, now if all of a sudden, you know, we're trying to figure out what this number is, maybe the only way to get to a more legitimate answer of what that number is beyond our own personal feelings and perceptions, then we would say, okay, let's take a look at what properties have sold for in the market, what their cap rates were, what the expected growth rate was, come back to our discount rate, and then from there saying, okay, yeah, the risk-free rate for government securities is this, and that allows us to then back solve for the risk premium. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Justin?
yeah, I know this is a little off subject, but as far as the risk-free rate, like a government premium, I just am not familiar with what that would be.
Well, no, I mean, okay, what you're going to do, open up,
Security.
basically, just Google short-term, long-term government securities. Okay, what the current prevailing, you know, rate is on those securities, whether it's, once again, short-term T-bills, long-term T-bonds, though, and then you're setting the maturity relative to what the maturity of this potential investment would be in terms of how many years. Like, in other words, if you're planning on making a 5-year investment, then you would want to match it up with 5-year securities.
And then, but in a problem, you would give us the growth rate and the cap rate.
Yeah, I've got to give you something to
Yeah,
start
exactly,
with, the back
exactly.
solve.
Okay.
Okay, but you're also saying to find a risk premium is that you would have to compare other building rates,
Yes,
and then you would take an average from those rates to,
right.
to find the opinion by mind adding it.
Yeah, you're just gonna, once again, you're just gonna back solve. Okay. All right, moving forward. Okay. All right, we've already talked about the cash flow cap rate. Did that earlier. All right, and now jump on in to the next substantive topic. Commercial mortgage-backed securities. I'm sorry?
We didn't go over
cash flow cap
Yeah,
rates.
we did, that was the very first thing we did.
Oh, it's just all linked in together
Yeah.
with the.
Okay, all right, commercial mortgage-backed securities. Tell me what you know.
Nothing. You buy security or a bond that's backed by mortgages based on commercial properties and the idea that they won't default and they'll pay you back a return on your money.
That is really good,
Thanks.
okay? The reason commercial mortgage-backed securities sort of came into being is they were a product of, have you heard the term financial engineering?
Alec
You've
has.
heard the term, okay? Financial engineering. Okay, so it's not engineering in the sense of engineering, but it is basically taking financial instruments and reorganizing them, repositioning them in a way to create something new and different, okay? And to create potentially new risk-return profiles for assets, in this case for mortgages, all right? And so, and this is pretty fascinating stuff, because this is what, to a certain extent, because of the mispricing of these commercial mortgage-backed securities, this was pretty much what led to the 2007 collapse in the real estate market, okay? It was really, most of it was tied to commercial mortgage-backed securities, and, well, we'll explain why. Okay, so let's just say we've got a situation, keep things simple here. You go in and you get a commercial mortgage or even a residential mortgage. It can be residential mortgage-backed securities, but what we're focused on are commercial. But you go in, you get a mortgage on your building, and let's say that your building is $500,000, your building is $1 million, yours is $5 million, yours is $700,000, yours is, $20 million, yours is, and so forth, so on. We have all these different mortgages, okay? Different valued buildings, okay? And so I'm a local bank, and let's say that I have a lending limit at my local bank of, I don't know, $20 million, all right? That's the cash I have available at my local bank to lend out to prospective borrowers, okay? So I make all these loans to all of these folks for their commercial properties, and I charge them, whatever interest rate that I charge them on those loans. But then what we do is I package up all of those loans together into a portfolio, all right? And so let's say there's maybe 15, 20 or more, could be 100, doesn't really matter what the number is, but a bunch of these commercial loans, I package them up, and there's like $20 million worth of loans that I then sell off to institutional investors, okay? Now, you're saying, who are these institutional investors? Well, primarily, one of the biggest players are pension funds, okay? And they want to buy, potentially, these mortgages. But they don't really want to buy them strictly as mortgages. They want something to happen to them before they just buy this pool of mortgages. They want them to be financially re-engineered in such a way to minimize their risk. And you're saying, well, how can we do that? Okay, well, let's back up the train for a second. So, not only do you have me having my $20 million as a lender, I've got 4 other banks here in town that also, let's say, have $20 million. So together, the 5 of us have how much? $100 million. All right? So all of us want to sell off our loans. So what we do is we find basically a company, a Wall Street-based sort of firm that is going to consolidate and warehouse our loans in a way to where that $100 million worth of loans are all going to be combined together. Okay? And what's going to happen is, you're going to have done all the calculations to figure out what the payoff for that portfolio is going to be. So let's just say
That's the face value?
that's the face value.
Okay.
That's a good way to, we'll call it that, the face value of our little portfolio is $100 million. Okay, now, let's say that within that portfolio, that on average, all of the loans taken together will throw off a rate of return of, let's say, 5%. Okay? Does everybody follow that? An annual rate of return of 5%. Now that's assuming everybody pays on time, no one defaults, whatever, 5% overall rate of return. Okay, everybody comfortable up to this point? Okay. Now, this is where the fun begins. So, the fun is re-engineering this to where maybe we create multiple investment opportunities or tranches. Okay? And so, let's say that we want to create 3 different tranches. We want to create tranche A, tranche B, and tranche C. Now, the first question, hopefully out of your mouth, would be, what the heck is a tranche? Okay? A tranche is basically a trench. Okay?
Spelled differently?
Yeah. But it's more kind of like a French, I suppose, spelling. But what this basically boils down to, and the reason why it's sort of called this, it sort of originated with like irrigating like a farm. Okay? And I can give another example that probably illustrates the concept even better, but let's just start with the farm example. So, let's just say, I can't draw.
You don't want to use World War I trench warfare for this example?
Well, yeah, okay. So, let's just say,
No, the water example works better.
yeah, the water example works better. And in this case, so, yeah, once again, I'm probably not drawing this the best way.
Just do 2 more C's.
And, okay. So, actually, I have a better way of explaining this. But, in other words, what you're saying is that let's say that we pour in water up here, all right? Well, it's going to sort of flow down, and then depending on, and once again, I didn't do a very good job, but let's just say that all of this trench or tranche has to fill up first. Okay, we got like a little barrier here. Once it fills up and it's at capacity, then the floodgate opens up, and now tranche B is able to fill up. And then once that fills up, then now it releases and you can fill up tranche C and so forth, so on. Now the better example to use is the wedding glass example, which is, you at a wedding, you have those stacked glasses, they pour champagne in the top glass, and what happens? It fills up, and then it overflows into the next group, into the next group, and into the next group, okay? But which one gets filled up first? The top one, or tranche A, okay? And then once tranche A has been filled and satisfied, then the leftovers go to tranche B. Once tranche B is filled up and satisfied, then we go to tranche C. Okay, so here's the point. Erase all this horrible nonsense. I can't draw. Erase. Oh, there we go. All right. So let's just say that this, okay, you tell me, over the 3 tranches, the total that we would need to come up with is 100%. Okay, in terms of how we sort of break apart these 3 different groupings of that $100 million portfolio. So what percentage are we going to sell off to, let's say, A? Let's just say 10%.
You say sell off.
Okay, I'll explain. Just give me a second. All right, and so let's say that with B, we're going to do 30%. So what does that leave me for C? 60%. Now the percentages I've chosen there are basically artificial, okay? Other than, I just sort of said, that's the percentage I'm going to allocate to the A tranche, that's the percentage I'm going to allocate to the B tranche, and that's the percentage I'm going to allocate to the C tranche. Okay, so in other words, this represents 10% of the overall portfolio. So if we have $100 million in the portfolio, this would represent what? 10 million. This would represent 30 million. This would represent 60 million. Okay, is everybody with me? Okay, but now this is the fund. The fund is, all right, I say to the folks that are buying that A tranche level security, I'm going to give you a fixed rate of return of 2%. But yet you're saying, wait a second, the overall portfolio is yielding 5%. But I'm only going to pay you 2%. Why? Because you get paid first. Okay? And because you get paid first, I, in essence, have created a risk-free security for you. Because when I say you get paid first, you're being paid out of the proceeds of the portfolio. So you've got $100 million worth of loans. Tranche A, while they're buying 10% of that portfolio, they're not buying a specific 10%. They're buying 10% of the pool. Okay? It's sort of like saying you've got a bottle of champagne that you're pouring into those glasses. You're buying basically 10% of the liquid in that bottle. Does that make sense? Okay, so you know that whenever it gets poured out, since you're the first to basically get the champagne in tranche A, you're going to get paid. Does that make sense? Okay, then in tranche B, let's say that we're going to pay these guys maybe 4%. Okay, because they're next in line to get paid. All right, so as a result, they get 4% of basically the annual income that this portfolio of loans throws off. Now tranche C, if we basically have these numbers, what we want to do is we want to back solve for what percent in a perfect situation would they walk away with as a rate of return. Does that make sense? Yes or no? It's like a weighted average. Okay? So in essence, what you could do
should you do to the bottom also, like
Yeah.
as a total?
okay?
So the 10% times.
Yeah, you just do 10 times 2, let's just do 20, 30 times 4, 120, and then we don't know that one yet. So it would be 60 basically times X, if you will. And then 500. Okay? Now you could make adjustments. If you want to do percentages, you can just do percentages and come up the same. Okay. So in essence, what we would then do is say, okay, we basically have 500 and we know this is 120 and we know this is 20. Yes?
6.
So we basically would subtract out 140, those two combined. So 500 minus 140 would be 360. Okay, all right. So that is going to be 360. But then what we're doing to obviously what we're wanting to find out is really what X is, what the question mark is. So you're going to do 360 divided by 60, and that's going to give you 6. Okay? So in other words, what you're able to do with the tranche C folks is actually pay them a rate higher than the overall portfolio is earning, because you're basically shorting the other two groups or other two tranches because they're being paid last. Okay? You're saying, well, why would they be willing to accept that? Well, they're getting a higher, theoretically, higher than normal rate of return off of their investment. Does that make sense? Yes or no?
Yes.
But the caveat is, all right, you stop paying, you go into foreclosure, you stop paying, you go into foreclosure, you stop paying, you go into foreclosure, and so forth, so on, what begins to happen to that bottom 60% of income? It starts chipping away to the point of where maybe they end up with nothing as a rate of return. Now, if everybody pays like they're supposed to, they're going to be pretty happy with their 6% rate of return. But if people stop paying or they get foreclosed on, they're going to be the first ones to be hurt. But you would have to have 90% of the portfolio blow up before Group A would ever be touched. Does that make sense? Is everybody following on this? Yes or no? Okay. Now, the reason why, or part of the reason why, this blew up in 2007 is because you had the folks that were packaging these deals together basically not doing the appropriate due diligence to really say how risky the overall portfolio of loans were. And also, they were putting a higher and higher percentage of the tranches being sold into tranche A, meaning that a smaller and smaller percentage would potentially have to blow up before the tranche A people would be hit. Does that make sense? And so, in essence, as a result, it blew up, and it blew up pretty bad. And the problem with this sort of financial engineering is, I mean, think about it like this. This is, in some instances, in my suspicion, this is the first time you've ever seen this, okay? Or at least explained like this. The average ordinary person on the street clearly has never seen this, never would understand this. All they're doing is going and getting a mortgage. They're not really thinking about, my mortgage is being sold off into this portfolio, and this portfolio is then being sold off, you know, as a security that's within one of these CMBS tranches, you know, and you know, it makes the disconnect to this very substantial. But here's the thing. The people that were investing in like these A tranches specifically, that thought they were getting completely risk-free securities, the pension funds, a lot of them got completely hosed because they didn't realize the true riskiness of what they were investing in, because they didn't understand how it was really being put together and the risk profile associated with it. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay. Thoughts, questions, observations? Chase?
Tangent, but is it true, and like I don't know if you look into this often or if anyone else can answer, but I heard that there might be like student loan backed securities.
Yep.
Is that a terrifying thought?
Yep.
Okay.
No, and it's the same exact concept.
Right. I mean, I see so many people that just keep taking different master's degrees so they can defer their hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt by getting more hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And then I think, oh, cool, we're betting on that? Like.
No, I mean, that's the thing. These sorts of things emerged probably in the early 90s, I mean, late 80s, early 90s, and you know, really became super popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, and as I said, then it got to a point of where the analysts that were really being charged with properly valuing these and properly assessing the risk associated with them didn't really know what they were doing, and were in many cases inflating the returns relative to the risk.
Well, I mean, if there wasn't residential lenders, like having people do like, you know, sign and get whatever they want and put their dog's name and get, you know, get loans, then this wouldn't be an issue.
No, it's actually not true. It would still be an issue.
How so?
Because of the fact that
The underlying asset is, if someone's paying their mortgage and they're being underwritten by the loan originator, then there's no reason for it to default.
But you don't understand the problem with the whole situation was REE. They were writing these for the purpose of that. Like he said, nobody would understand this on the Joe Schmo. The people that understood this purposely written so it could fall apart like that. Because in the beginning, when this all started, they secured it with the government of Fannie Mae and FHA. So they secured it with the government. Just like the student loans he's talking about. The government is promising these people that they're going to get bailed out if they don't get paid.
I mean, but that's just, I mean, yeah, I mean, I feel
So
you.
so the model came up from the top. It wasn't just because it wouldn't, like right now in the real estate, you can't just say I'm gonna put, if somebody didn't allow you to put your dog name on the loan, it would have never happened. So like, nothing's happened.
I mean, that's still
badly.
true though, it doesn't make it less true. You know what I'm saying?
saying?
That's the fact.
I mean, there was a lot of underwriting that took place that was inappropriate, no question about it. I mean, in the sense of you had low doc, no doc loans, you had fraud that was rampant, you had
No income
underwriters-
verification, nothing, just,
You had underwriters or specifically loan originators that were not being held responsible for the accuracy of the documents that they were providing to the underwriters. There's a whole litany of issues, but it was just kind of like this big basket of issues all rolled up into a situation of then these loans that were backing this weren't necessarily, in some cases, legitimate loans to begin with.
but also, you know, like you're saying, them being tied to, you know, having being bailed out by tax dollars.
Well, and see, that's the
There's no
thing. On the
incentive.
residential side, yes, but on the commercial side, no. Different animal.
So then that would kind of counteract what you're saying, which is that they wouldn't make an instrument to purposely fail.
What I'm saying is that when the crash market wasn't the commercial side, it was the residential side.
I'm sure the commercial was heavily impacted.
Oh, absolutely it was. No, I mean, it's, oh, okay, let's not get too far off the base here, but all we're saying is that this is a type of vehicle that allowed for greater funding of real estate loans than would have been possible otherwise. Okay? But here's a simple fact.
Because they're getting bought at premiums on the secondary market.
Right.
Okay,
So the simple lesson out of this is there was a lack of available capital for borrowers to access. So the folks on Wall Street said, hey, let's figure out a way to make more capital available to borrowers with real estate backed securities. And so that's where the birth of this sort of came from. And what they were doing is they were trying to create these instruments that were, in essence, risk-free instruments. And the reason was that was what pension funds, for the most part, were limited to investing in. There's a law still out there, it's called ERISA, the Employment Retirement Income Security Act of like 1970 or something like that. And basically what it says, when you boil it all down, is if you're a pension fund, retirement fund, you are pretty much limited in your scope of what you can invest in. So they cannot directly invest in mortgages, but indirectly they can invest in this financially engineered instrument that is backed by mortgages because of the way the structure is set up to where it is in essence created the equivalent of a risk-free security. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay? And that's what drove a lot of the capital to the market and created this overabundance of capital out there chasing real estate deals.
So the pension funds got hit the hardest in this?
You know, in a good piece of this, yes. And government pension funds, not only from this country, from other countries that were investing in it. So my point is very simple. This was, and it still exists, mortgage-backed securities still exist, but more regulation has been placed upon them to do more accurate valuations of the individual tranches and risk assessment of those tranches. Okay? Yep.
Yeah, this might be off on a tangent too, but if the Federal Reserve rate is lower, doesn't that increase the money supply? So
Yes.
wouldn't that, okay, but wouldn't that?
Here's,
also
okay,
increase-
here's the deal.
Right.
And this is part of what your whole reading was about. What we have had happen over the past 15, 20 years, we have had an abundant supply of capital, cheap capital, available to invest in real estate in one way, shape, form, or fashion. And when I say cheap, I mean cheap. You know, compared to, you know, whenever I first, you know, got my very first house, my very first mortgage in 1991, it was like 8.5% interest rate, okay? And that was like the best rate that was pretty much available at that particular point in time, okay? Now, almost anybody walking off the street can get what?
3%.
Yeah, somewhere, you know, less than half of what that rate was. But during that interval, from let's say 1991 to now, what has changed? Basically, the available supply of money that is out there to be able to fund real estate investments. In other words, cheaper sources of capital for banks, cheaper sources of capital for commercial lenders and investors. And so what effect that has had is that has driven up, inflated the values of the properties.
How are people saying that inflation is so low if prices are well above what they were in 06 and 07? How are they saying that it's like?
Inflation's not low, inflation's actually.
Depends on what they're talking about too when they say prices. It's not everything.
Because real estate is not the only indicator of inflation,
Yeah.
okay? You know, it's all the other basket of goods and services, you
Yeah,
know, in terms
prices,
of actual, you know, food and beverages and then other items that are available for sale in the marketplace that may have a different level of price increase or stability than what real estate has.
Okay.
And so just general inflation may not necessarily have a one-to-one relationship with what is happening with real estate prices. But the point with real estate is the very first lesson, I know I've said this before, if interest rates are low, real estate prices are high.
Yep.
Okay? If interest rates are high, real estate prices are low. Okay? It's just an inverse relationship, and it all comes back to the cap rate, the discount rate, you know, risk premium, all of that tied in together is just simply reflecting that reality. And so what happens at some point, one would think we're going to eventually move into a more traditional real estate environment, or more traditional interest rate environment, where interest rates are going to creep upward. And when that happens, or we expect it to happen, that will have a negative impact on the values. Now, what has happened is that because this cost of capital and because these interest rates have been really low, it has had a really positive impact on the underlying value of the real estate assets, therefore, in my opinion, artificially increasing the value of a lot of those real estate assets, and people being willing to accept much lower rates of return on the property than they should accept because of that super cheap source of capital. Now, the way that your book kind of phrased it was they said, real estate with weak fundamentals, okay, in essence, is being overpriced because of that super cheap source of capital.
But interest rates can't go up because then people are going to default.
I'm not saying they won't, but at some point, if you assume that the federal government or just the economic climate or environment is going to dictate higher interest rates, that's going to have a negative impact on real estate, pure and simple. I mean, but at some point you have to sort of assume that that is probably going to happen. Now, unless we continue to have this perpetual sort of downward grinding kind of experience where the people are willing to accept lower and lower and lower rates of return. Okay, Kenny?
When the book said weak fundamentals, I took it as financials weren't as to par with the financials weren't strong on the property. But you're saying it's based on...
Okay. Relative to, basically, the returns they might be getting. Or relative to the amount of money that people were willing to invest in them. In other words, let's say that I've got a property that's earning a 4% rate of return, okay, on an annual basis. I don't think that's very interesting or very sexy to invest in, but there are people out there that are willing to accept a 4% rate of return. okay? I would argue that is a fundamentally weak property with a 4% rate of return.
Absolutely.
Okay, but there are people out there that are chasing that deal, willing to accept that ridiculously low rate of return, and the only really good explanation that we have for that is that the cost of capital is so ridiculously cheap for them that they're willing to accept that, and they're thinking and they're betting on that at some point the value on that is going to escalate dramatically.
So it's a combination of both the fundamentals and the market.
Right.
All right.
But see, part of the problem,
Follows the money.
okay, let me answer your question.
The question, this is gonna be a question. You said when the rates are down, the value goes up, right?
Right.
And then when the rates are high.
It's
value
it's
goes
inverse,
up.
yes.
Okay, it's inverse. But how about this new thought is if the rates are low and value starts creeping down because people cannot pay that rate or cannot pay that.
Well, that's in essence what, okay. The reason why there's that inverse relationship is because a higher interest rate means that you've got less purchasing power. Okay, let me make sure that I really just hit this on the head so we can put it to bed.
And there'd be less money in the money supply in people's hands if the interest rate is higher.
Right, but okay, let me make this exceedingly simple. Okay, you earn $100,000 a year. All right, of that $100,000, a lender will allow you, let's say, to spend 30% of that on your mortgage and housing related expenses. So that means $30,000 a year, yes? Okay, now, if we divide that by 12, that works out to $2,500 per month. That is our purchasing power as an individual for real estate, yes? Okay, now, we go over here and we create a mortgage. 12 payments per year, 30-year term, 360 months, and we're going to put in $2,500 as our payment amount. Okay, that's the amount we can afford for our mortgage. Now, let's say that interest rates on mortgages are currently 5%. What would that mean the mortgage value of that property would be?
$165,704.
Hold on.
You're too quick, John.
Okay, so $465,704.04. Okay, so assuming that everyone else in the market is in the same exact boat as I am, $100,000 a year, they spend $30,000 or 30% of their income, or $2,500 a month on their mortgage. That is their purchasing power. That is the maximum mortgage that they would be able to get. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Interest rates go up. Interest rates go up to 6%.
Your buying power goes down.
Your buying power goes down. Now,
But you're already locked in and people have
so your buying power goes down $416,979.04. Okay? Interest rates go up some more. So let's say 7%. Buying power goes down some more. Now we're down to $375,768. Okay? Now, Cole's point is well taken. Okay, you're locked into your mortgage and okay, fine. But not everyone is locked in simultaneously in the entire market. You're always going to have people buying and selling homes every single year. You know, so you buy your home this year, you buy yours the next year, you buy yours the next year, and so forth, so on. So you've constantly got all that friction occurring in the market where depending on what the interest rates are doing, those values are going to have to adjust. The point is, if the overall market can only afford $2,500 a month because their wages are not increasing beyond $100,000, that is all they can afford. That is their purchasing power. That is it. So when the interest rates start to climb, their purchasing power goes down, meaning they can no longer afford a $465,000 house. They can only afford a $365,000 house. Therefore, interest rates go up, prices go down. It's as simple as that. Does that make sense?
Understood.
Okay?
I understand the relativity of that. What I was pointing out was, how about if you can no longer earn that 25,000?
Yeah, exactly. It's just like
And
now
you're
default's
locked in
low.
at that 5%, and then now everybody's in that same boat, cannot earn that $2,500 for whatever's going on in the economy, and we're all locked in at that 5%. What happens to the value?
Then it goes down even more.
Because that's what I'm saying, because now we cannot pay the interest rate or the mortgage on that home.
Right. But all I'm trying to illustrate is the fundamental part of the concept. Interest rates go up, value goes down. That's it.
That's it.
Okay? All right. Moving forward.
So just, no, I'm kidding.
Go ahead. I just want to make sure I get
No, that was really
time
it.
for the
That was
quizzes.
really it.
Okay? What else?
That's it.
Okay.
Explain it perfectly.
All right. Okay. So basically, once again, now, what would happen if you were to own what is referred to as a real estate investment trust? Okay, real estate investment trust. Okay. Back in the late 1950s, the birth of the real estate investment trust happened. And the reason it happened was it was a new vehicle for people to invest in real estate. And the way that it worked is you created this corporation, and the corporation was a real estate investment trust. But it had special tax benefits. And those special tax benefits were that as long as the income that you made off of that real estate investment trust were plowed back into the real estate investment trust, meaning it was sort of self-contained, as it were.
Like 1031?
No, that's a totally different thing. That's a tax-deferred exchange. Totally different animal. Okay? So this, in essence, is a corporation. You would set it up, you could sell shares of stock in it. It could be publicly traded, it could be privately traded, it could be an equity REIT, it could be a mortgage REIT, it could be a hybrid REIT, all different kinds of variations. But the point is, it is an entity set up to own and operate real estate with tax advantages. The tax advantages being that it was a complete, what is called flow-through entity, meaning that whatever income that it would generate, you would then push out those returns to the investors, and those investors would then be taxed at their own individual rates. It, as a corporate entity, would not be taxed. Now, it's somewhat similar, but with different nuanced differences to like an S-Corp, a small business corporation, or to a limited liability company. Once again, slightly different, but these were set up specifically for owning and operating real estate. And so what has happened then, a proliferation of these began to hit basically Wall Street, ultimately publicly traded real estate investment trust. Actually, if you go to NAREIT, the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trust.org, I think, website, they've got all these different publicly traded REITs all over the country, all their different specializations, specializing in some cases just office buildings or just a particular state within the country, or just they've got different, sort of profiles as to what they actually invest in. But the point is, it was a way for you as an individual. So, Chase could say, all right, I've got $1,000 that I want to buy X number of shares of stock in this particular real estate investment trust that owns office properties in Columbus, Ohio. Okay, Chase could do that. Okay, without having to buy the physical real estate itself, and could then tomorrow say, I no longer like Columbus, Ohio real estate. I can sell it tomorrow and be out of that investment. Okay, whereas directly investing in the real estate itself, you'd have to do what? Go and find the property, buy the property, finance the property, do all of that. All of that's taken care of for you. All you have to do is just find the kind of property you want to invest in, buy shares of stock in it, own it for as long as you want, and then divest it whenever you want. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what has happened over a period of time is that these have become ridiculously lucrative sort of investments that have not, in some cases, tied mark to market in the sense of the valuations on these don't sometimes reflect reality. And what I mean by that is this, and your book talks all about this. You may have had this portfolio of $10 million worth of property whenever this trust was started. And it's throwing off, I don't know, a 5% rate of return. And people buy in that 5% rate of return initially. But then over time, more and more people, for whatever reason, are willing to accept lower than a 5% rate of return and start chasing after the shares of stock in this, driving basically the return, if you are buying it at these inflated values, where the new purchasers, in essence, are getting a lower and lower percent rate of return, but the ones that maybe have owned it for a few years end up capitalizing on that. And part of what your book is sort of talking about is, this gets back to this whole weak fundamentals thing, that mad money is sort of chasing some of these deals where it's like the properties in some of these portfolios are offering ridiculously low rates of return that don't correlate with what their return should be. Does that make sense? But because they're in, publicly traded, whatever, somehow, some way, people see a disconnect. And mad money is sort of chasing after these. And so, what your judgment author is saying is, for the past several years, some of the owners in these real estate investment trusts, because of the compression, of the cap rates getting lower and lower, that the owners in some of these shares have made out like bandits, in terms of the rates of return that they have gotten, but yet the new owners of those shares, not so much. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Any questions? Okay, moving forward. Okay. All right. CAPM, capital asset pricing model.
Yeah, I don't know. We can see that on the tips. Then they can fill in the blank here, like finish the sentence.
All right. Now, as Kenny was pointing out earlier, or mentioned earlier, briefly throughout, was this about CAPM, or so in finance, they came up with this model many years ago to try to explain and to understand, the relationship between individual securities or individual stocks relative to the overall stock market itself. And so what we've tried to do is adapt this model to a certain extent to fit certain aspects of real estate. So here's how the model works. You in essence have the overall rate of return for a particular asset, and that is going to be equal to the risk-free rate plus, in this case, the
Beta.
Beta, but that's the risk.
Risk-free rate minus
No,
1.
it's the risk of a specific asset Okay, I'm trying to write this out instead of using the nomenclature that, all the little abbreviations and everything else they use, like in the textbook and other places, so you kind of have a sense of what it is. Okay, so we have the risk of a specific asset, in this case, times the market return percent. minus the risk-free rate, which is, again, also a percentage. Okay, so over here, this is a percent. Okay, this is not a percent. Okay, this is more like a factor. All right, so let's just sort of start and kind of fill this in. All right, we talked about earlier, and the risk-free rate is what? Some sort of government security, you know, and so let's just say that's going to be 2%. So I'm just plopping in 2% there on both sides for our risk-free rate. Okay, everybody with me? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, now the market return in this case would be, could be, and this is where all the judgmentally kind of things come into play. Here we could say the overall market for all of real estate assets. We could also tighten up that description, say only office building assets. We could tighten it up even further. Only office building assets in Fort Lauderdale. Tighten it up even further. Only Class A office buildings in downtown Fort Lauderdale. You follow what I'm saying? So how you define your market is going to dictate what that appropriate rate of return is that you're going to use for means of comparison. Does that make sense? Okay, but that's a choice that you would ultimately, you know, have to make. Okay, what market are we really talking about to be as useful and as accurate as we possibly can be? So let's just say we have landed upon an overall market return, whichever market we have chosen, and it's 8%. Okay? So, what that means is we still have a couple of missing variables, but we can go ahead and solve at least one piece of this. The market return minus the risk-free rate, that's going to be 6%. Okay? Everybody with me? All right? Now, let's say that the risk of a particular asset, let's just, for fun, let's make that 1. So it's not a percent, it's just a 1. Okay? Now, think about what that would sort of do to our model. 1 times 6% would be what? 6% plus the risk-free rate of 2% would mean the overall return would be 8%, which happens to equal the market return. Okay, you're starting to see something? Well, what we're saying is this specific asset, if it has a factor of 1, that means it's the same as the overall market. Okay? So by it being a factor of 1, we're saying then it really is 8%. Everybody follow that? Mathematically. Okay? Now, if it's 0,
It'll be 2%.
okay? 0 times 6% is 0 plus 2. Now what are we saying there? We're saying this particular asset, whatever it is a risk-free asset. It has 0 risk. Does everybody follow me? Okay. Now what if, just hang with me, what if you find an asset that has, let's say, twice the risk of the traditional sort of market? Okay, well then it's going to be 2 times 6, which would be 12, plus 2, or 14%. Okay, because here's what's happening. Oops. How many of you remember your basic high school math class and the slope of a line? Y equals mx plus b. Does that ring any bells to anybody? That's what the CapEx pricing model is. Okay? So in essence, what's really happening here is right here, the y-intercept is the risk-free rate. Okay? The slope of the line, rise over run, is what? The risk. Okay? And then here...
Wait, which risk? The market risk? Or
yeah, no, the overall risk. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, the overall risk is... Here we have return, just make sure. Okay, so on the y-axis, we have return expressed as a percent. On the x-axis, we have risk, so it's 0 risk, 2% rate of return. At a risk of 1, we said it was going to be what? 8%. A risk of 2, be 14%. Okay? So in other words, all that little formula is doing is just mathematically representing this. Okay? So that if we kind of were to go in and we were to say, oh, the risk is 1.5 times greater, then it's going to be something between 8 and 14%. You follow? Or if it has half of the risk, then it's going to be somewhere between 2 and 8%. Okay? Now, don't get too hung up on this other than, okay, yeah, really simple little calculation, okay? But here's what you're trying to do with this. Let's try to put the rubber to the road in terms of what this is all about. What we're trying to do is simply come up with a model that tries to reflect some sort of reality and some sort of set of assumptions that we deem to be useful and relevant to do a better job of coming up with a valuation or a pricing or a rate of return that's appropriate for a particular asset we're trying to value. Does that make sense conceptually? So the variables that we are using is we're sort of starting out with, yeah, okay, our risk-free rate, we know we need to get that at an absolute minimum, okay? And we know we need to know what market we're referencing this particular asset to know whether we need to be above the market or below the market in terms of the risk and the return associated with it. And then we need to know for this particular asset that we're trying to value, this particular property, how does it fit within that market? Is it the same risk as the overall market? Does it have no risk at all? Or is it twice the risk or something else? And then that ultimately then dictates what the overall rate of return for that particular asset should be. Now, before kind of get into anything substantive here, what I'm trying to say about this is a super simple, basic framework, okay, to try to represent reality. Think of it like this. The way I like to think of a lot of these sort of conceptual models is, it's sort of like this model explains how to play checkers. But life is chess, okay? And so, in essence, this oversimplification, is merely trying to get you to start thinking about some of the assumptions that you really should be thinking about whenever you are making an investment. But the reality is there's so many other things that you really need to consider that you would need to expand upon this very basic foundation to be able to make the direct application into reality. Okay? You agree with that, Kenny?
Oh, absolutely.
So, okay. You have a question, Paul?
Yeah, market return, and you said that's overall market?
It could be whatever market specifically it is that you are trying to, you're saying that this asset you're valuing, what market does it exist within? Okay. And how you define that market is up to you. And in the sense of, like for example, you've found 10 properties that have recently sold in this particular geographic region of this particular property type, and they have all sold with a rate of return on an annual basis of 8%. But yet this property that you're buying, you perceive it to be identical to all of those properties for the most part. So you would basically say the risk of it is 1, therefore you should get an 8% rate of return. But you could also find another property that you're saying this property is really screwed up on so many different levels that as a result it maybe has twice the risk associated with it than the market. Therefore, I need to buy it at a bigger discount and in essence get a higher rate of return because it's really screwed up. Does that make sense? Okay, anybody else? All right, good.
Back to the REIT question though. What is that? I mean, what are you gonna ask on the quiz?
You'll be fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Is there no math?
That was a good catch.
Is it just the definition?
Look, just trust me a little bit. Okay. All right. Now, we've got two final concepts and then we can move on.
Can we take a quick break?
All right, take a quick break, 5-minute break.
That was a lot smoother than Sam Miguel's question. No offense, but
When are we gonna get a break?
yeah. The next time. Right, we'll get a break and then proceed to talk for 20 more minutes.
Typically, in the real estate investment process,
I was like,
when they're investing, do they typically looking for like lower caps then because they have a higher, usually have more money in the trust?
Well, they're willing to accept a lower rate of return because the cost of capital is cheap.
Stretch it out to 9.
Shift equal 9. Oops, that's good. Okay, do one more time. Shift equal 9. There you go.
So I can't put in the law class and development class. Decide.
Well, I mean, the investments class, obviously, and then the
Besides the other three.
yeah, you know, that's all we're offering. Well, that's the way it's set up to be finished in a year, and if you don't do it over a year, it's over 2 years.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it's actually happening. I thought. See. How's that? Could you? Yeah.
I tried to like set up
I get it.
development, but it's like it's too much to like.
Yeah,
push it out.
he didn't give I just copied whatever was on the screen and then I backward engineered to get the actual variables that he.
Yeah, but I didn't like go because he like hard coded all this stuff.
Yeah, but you can backward engineer it.
Yeah.
Because you can take the initial assumption. Like, there was a couple of things that he, like the square footage, you know, how he said it was like 50%.
It wasn't right. It wasn't right when you meant to multiply, right?
Yeah.
I was like,
because I backward engineered it and he used a different set of
I
numbers.
was like, why have that there if you're just gonna use the hard code or something else?
Ah, yeah, I don't know.
But I know that when I did the math backwards, it didn't work out because I got 321,000 square feet and he used something different. Yeah, I like set up the frames and float. Yeah, because I assume we're gonna go into more depth tonight.
Did you do that in the slides?
I didn't read. I read chapters and then I like went through the slides and I like wrote little notes, but I didn't really go through this extra slides. I figured it's hard because even the ones on the book didn't really make sense by themselves. You know what I mean?
See, I definitely almost everything. That's what he's taking off points from.
Better take out the grid. Better take out the grid lines.
Okay. Like if you look at everything, that's where he took off all my points. So you see? I basically just used whatever he
Yeah,
said.
I did. At 20.9% of that is not bad.
Yeah. No.
It's like 3.
What are you doing? And even this, when he said the sales price, I couldn't figure out the sales price, so I just copied it and I like did something. Yeah, I couldn't figure out the actual sales price.
I didn't go through that. I
It's
watched
hard
it.
what it is. It's still, it's frustrating.
The first one was what? The first video.
Yeah, that was the bond pricing.
Oh, that's
That was easy.
it was but also like a.
I did that.
Yeah, we did it here too. So I did another one.
No, yeah, me too. Me too. This one, he said 10 years, right?
Oh yeah, all those amortization, like the interest only and then the variable. Like I think I got it.
Because he said interest only straight for 10 years. Right? So then, is right when it goes to the balloon?
So he was saying 2 years in verbally, but on this thing it said 10 years.
Yeah. And then in the end, before he closed, he was like, oh yeah, 10 years.
Oh, he did?
Yeah.
I did. Yeah, but it doesn't really matter. No, it matters that you can set it up for each.
Yeah, because you don't know if you're right or not.
That's true, but like yeah, no, he kept saying 2, and I set it up, and like, didn't he get it? He said 10 up on top, but then he had it months 1 through 24, so I was like,
That doesn't seem right. That's your balloon payment after you not paid for 10 years.
no, that's your negative. It should be, your balloon payment is before that. So like it's amortized over 30 years.
Yeah, I did that.
But yeah, so you got that, but then your balloon payment is after like 10 years.
Yeah, it starts amortizing.
So that's your Oh, so I set it up like that, and then he do the balloon payment at 120. I think he did
All I
in
know
his
is
spreadsheet.
that one got me.
He did interest only until 24, and then he amortized it after that. So then you add 120 and you got an actual. So if you like.
He lying to you, Kenny. He's gonna be lying about it.
So if you did like whatever.
And then you turn the balance negative, and that's future value, and then you solve for interest.
Unfortunately.
You don't really make a lot of it. It was just.
I don't know. I didn't make anything. I feel like he's gonna want us to make something.
It was very difficult to understand.
Yeah,
I watched it, I didn't like, you really watched it? I didn't go on Yeah, bro. We're gonna have a class assignment today.
See, that's what I think, but then we're gonna get there and it's gonna be like, I want you guys to do a 10 million year cash flow analysis.
Is it gonna be off of
360
the
months,
yeah,
year we have.
was the second video more helpful than the
I
first?
remember that whole like quick 30 doesn't. Yeah, it was all wrong. I did maybe like a year, and she kept saying.
And they're both equally
And I'm
bad.
not giving you
You didn't understand that.
I mean, it was just so dense, and he doesn't build it. He just like shows up with 360 month cash flow. That's already built. He doesn't build it. Yeah, exactly. It's all built as soon as you start the video. Correct. So try to figure that out.
Did like what was like a 6-year amortization, it's like he's going down.
Yeah, and they're skipping chunks. Like things are missing. Like,
You only have so many hours, right? And then
Solve for payment.
5 hours.
Go to balance, make the balance negative, future value, and then.
Cole's so ready to fail this test today.
And then, you solve for, you do the end, and do the calculation.
So
Every time before the quiz, I wake up and I read that sheet. Hopefully it plays out.
but he didn't see any questions on REE.
Or like the difference between, like, you know, like, how you're gonna actually stabilize the why, or
Got 2 more topics we need to get through at a minimum.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Taking a quiz and then take a picture and then do the next one.
Okay. So, 2 topics that are not in this book, or at least not here. This is one of the interesting things about, you know, whenever you change books, and I changed books, and I thought, oh, this book will, it's a little bit more up to date than the one I've been using, the newer edition, and that sort of thing. And it doesn't have as many problems, it doesn't cover some of the material I used to cover, and so basically there are certain things I kind of interject here. So this is one of those topics, prepayment penalties. Okay. It does talk about prepayment penalties, but doesn't go into any sort of examples. All right. One of the things that we have talked about is whenever you get a commercial loan, in many cases, the lender will say, all right, you've got this loan for 5 years with, 20, 15, 25-year amortization, but if you pay it off prior to that 5 years, you're going to incur a prepayment penalty. Now, many of you, probably are like, well, why? Why would the lender charge me for paying off the loan early? Well, think about it like this. The lender, from their perspective, kind of has investment-backed expectations of the interest that they're going to be receiving off of you over the life of that loan. And so if you go in and get a loan from them, and then 6 months later you decide to sell the property and pay it off, as a general rule, they're not going to be thrilled about that, because they're basically saying, hey, we thought you were going to hold this loan for 5 years. Okay, does that make sense? So, what prepayment penalties were sort of meant to do was to help the lender kind of recover some of, basically, their costs associated with making that loan. But the thing is, like everything is tilted in favor of the lenders, okay? And so, here's the simple little thing to kind of pop in your head. This is conceptual. What about the calculation? We'll just follow the conceptual. Let's say that we've got a 5-year term on this loan, but the amortization period is, let's say, 15 years. Okay? That means at the end of the 5 years, automatically you're going to have a balloon note. Yes? But if you pay it off precisely at the end of that 5 years, you're not going to get incurred a prepayment penalty because you have met the conditions of the 5-year loan. Does that make sense? But if you pay it off 1 month prior to when it's due, you could very well be charged a prepayment penalty on the entire outstanding mortgage balance that you owe well beyond just that next payment. We're talking about for the remaining 10 years. Does that make sense? So the lender gets you. Okay? All right? So, let's sort of start up a little scenario. Okay? First of all, give me a dollar amount for the loan.
$5 million.
$5 million. All right? And this is going to be monthly, so 12 payments per year. Okay, clear everything out. All right, so $5 million is going to be our loan amount or our present value. Okay? Our term, or let's say our amortization period, is going to be what? Something greater than 5 years.
Oh, you said 15.
Okay, we'll do 15. Okay, 15 years. What's our interest rate?
7 3/4.
7 3/4.
Where's that one now?
7.75% as our interest rate. Okay, and then we would be ultimately solving for the payment to start with. Okay, all right. Now, before we go any further, how much are they going to charge us as a prepayment penalty if we pay off early? What percentage of our outstanding loan balance?
2%.
You said what?
2.5.
2.5.
All right.
Yay, compromise.
Financial engineering.
There we go. Learning those terms. I love it. Okay, now. Okay, so your prepayment penalty is going to be 2.5% of outstanding mortgage balance at time of loan prepayment. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? Okay, now, what do we have to do to basically get there? All right, so first thing we're going to do is just go ahead and calculate the payment on this loan. So let's go ahead and take care of that.
Is the present value negative or?
It doesn't really have to be either way. Okay. $47,063.79 rounded. Okay? Everybody good with that? Okay, now, when are we going to prepay? Okay? After how many years? Assuming that, once again, this is a 5-year term, okay? So anything that we prepay prior to the 5 years is going to be subject to the prepayment penalty.
When you say that, when you say 5-year term, do you call it like a 5-year term and a 15-year amortization?
Amortization, correct.
So that's like proper.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Speak the language.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, what? You're 3? Okay. So let's say, okay, paid off early at end of year 3. Okay? Now, so what we need to do is we need to find the balance at the end of the 3rd year. So we use our amortization function. 1, input, 36, shift, amortize, equal, equal, equal. That will give us our loan balance. Okay, so we get a balance of $4,403,455.87. Everybody match for that? Yes? Okay, so just to put things into perspective here, so everybody kind of just, focuses in. How far into the loan are we?
36 months,
36 months or
3 years.
okay, and so after 3 years, we still owe, once again, 4.4 million. So it's a lot that we still owe, all right? Now, what we're going to be charged is 2.5% of that as a prepayment penalty. Okay, so we just multiply that amount times 0.025. So for the privilege of paying off this loan early, we are paying the bank $110,086.40 rounded. Okay?
Just for that privilege?
Just for that privilege. Okay?
How nice of them. Andrew got it. You'll pay that, right?
Okay, so that's the amount that we're actually going to be prepaying. Okay, everybody good with that? All right. Now, if we wanted to make this easier for ourselves, to have fewer calculations, what we could do is to say, okay, we want to know the total amount that we're going to pay off. In other words, we want to know this amount, the 110, plus this amount, correct? So we could just add the two together, or instead of doing the calculation we did there, we could have just done times 1.025. That way it would multiply by itself and then add in the extra, and so we would get the total amount of the payoff. Okay. And in this case, let's see, 1.025, 4,513,542.27 is the total amount that we would have to pay off at that end of 3 years. Okay, everybody with me? Yes, no, possibly could be. Okay. Now, if we really want to shortcut this, okay, what we can then do is just simply put that amount. Don't clear everything out, just leave everything as is, but put that amount in as your future value. Okay, you don't, just put, after you got that number in your display, just hit future value. Okay? Then, after you've done that, Then you can put in 36 as in. Then you should be able to just hit interest rate.
36 in, not 36 shifting.
Correct, because we're just looking for making those payments for 36 months.
You gotta change the symbol.
You shouldn't have to. Oops. Well, okay, maybe we did have to. Hold on. We got 5 million. Okay, you're right. So you caught me. All right. I should have done that as a negative. All right, so we need to put the 45, 13, 542, 27 as a negative. That is the payoff amount. My brain.
And that's because the future, the present value is already like positive, so we just have to make them equal.
Right, because
whatever you do the first time, the inverse.
Yeah, it is the payoff amount. Okay. Back here.
Better.
There we go. So you should end up with 8.43% as your effective cost of borrowing.
Did you just put in the feature value, number of periods?
Yes. Or your lender's yield.
Yeah, I don't know why, but it approved for mine.
Okay? So once again, if you want to start over, once again, you can put in just the 5 million, put in the 15 years term, put in the interest rate, solve for payment. Then you can just put in this amount of 44.5 million as your negative future value, put in 36 in as your term, and then solve for the interest rate, and you should get the 8.43. Yep.
On the practice sheet, it was done annually. I don't know why though.
Well, it was an annual loan.
Annual.
This one's monthly. Okay. All right. Does that make sense? Now, what does that mean? That means that for this particular loan, the stated interest rate was 7.75%. But because of the incurred prepayment penalty, the real interest rate that we paid, or our effective cost of borrowing, or the lender's yield, is really 8.43%. Okay, so here's the way to look at this. Let me make sure that we spin it a different way. If we had another lender, and another lender offered us an interest rate of 8% with no prepayment penalties, which of the loans would be preferable?
That one.
Yeah, just an 8% with no prepayment penalty, because the one with the prepayment penalty, our true cost of borrowing is 8.43%.
Assuming that we know that we're going to
Correct.
prepay in year 3.
Correct.
Quick question, once we hit the, I guess we have to refresh the entire calculator once we re-enter the future value? Because when I click the interest, or the.
Basically,
the-
you're going to do prepaid and
Make it
calculate,
negative?
because remember, the
Oh,
original
okay.
interest rate was
That's, yeah, I skipped on that initially.
I mean, really,
So you're doing,
like
you're
half.
doing 36 and non-36 shift.
So if
Correct,
we
because it is only
wanna
36
avoid
months.
doing just
36 shift-in would say 36 years.
15.
You would take the other guy,
Okay.
you would avoid point.
At that point, what is your payment?
Your payment hasn't
We're
changed.
looking at this,
Okay, so
you
you're
this
just
one,
putting
but
in-
really.
Yeah, the payment's not changing. The only thing that's changing is you're gonna have this extra amount here, but you're basically, but that's being incorporated into your future value.
So you can't clear the calculator.
You can, you just have to start all over
You have to
again.
put the pin back.
Right.
Feel artsy.
Okay?
Negative future value.
She's looking art.
Okay.
All right, loan origination fees.
I know, it doesn't make sense, that's like the best deal ever. You can- you see, it's not that great.
All right. So, as we said, there is yet another way that lenders can make money. Okay, we talked about the prepayment penalty, where they get money at the back end if you pay off the loan early. But they also will make money on the front end whenever they charge you upfront loan origination fees. Okay? Now, loan origination fees, theoretically, are supposed to be the fees that they're charging you for doing all of the upfront paperwork and everything associated with getting kind of the loan ready to go. And so that, combined with the interest payment, combined with prepayment penalty, combined with any sort of servicing fees over the life of the loan, comprise their overall return. But what we're trying to do is just sort of isolate out initially each of these individual components so that we can kind of see what impact each one individually has on the borrower. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So in this case, give me another loan. Okay? Give me a dollar amount.
$7 million.
Okay, so first of all, 12 payments per year. Get that out of the way. Clear everything out. Okay, $7 million is what I heard. Okay, interest rate?
5.5.
5.5. Okay, term, or actually not term, but amortization period?
So it's 20.
20? Okay, all right. So initially, let's go ahead and calculate the payment. $48,152.11. Okay. All right. Now, for the loan origination fee, this where it takes a little bit of mental logic to kind of understand what's really going on. What happens with the loan origination fee is this is money that technically you are paying out of pocket at the time you originate the loan. In other words, it's sort of like, to keep things simple since we've got more complicated numbers here, but let's just say I'm the lender, I'm giving you a $100,000 loan, all right? And I charge you, let's say, a 2% loan origination fee, okay? So I'm giving you $100,000, you're giving me back simultaneously what? $2,000.
So they just give you.
So really, you're only getting 98.
But do they just give you 90 or do they give you?
This is where the whole logic thing begins to come into place.
It seems illogical.
Just hold with me.
Okay.
So once again, I'm giving you $100,000 cash. Okay. In return, you are giving me back $2,000 cash. So the reality is, you're only receiving $98,000. Yes?
Yes.
But the loan that I'm giving you is still $100,000. So you're still having to pay back $100,000. So the reality is, if you want to sort of think about it, you're really out of pocket the $100,000 for the loan and the $2,000 for the upfront loan origination fee. So in total, you're out of pocket $102,000 over the life of the loan. Does that make sense?
Plus whatever the interest is.
Plus whatever the interest is on the $100,000. Right. You're not having to pay interest on the $2,000, okay? But you're just really deducting that from the initial proceeds.
So like, aren't there? I mean, I guess it makes more sense in a consumer side, and I know that's why they do it with like credit cards. I'm assuming on the B2B, like commercial side, they just kind of let people fend for themselves and figure it out. But like, so there's no kind of reporting requirements to make them basically say what is the bottom line. You know.
Oh yes, there is a Truth in Lending Act.
Oh, because I was going to say, like, it seems like this can get super complicated.
Predominantly, almost exclusively for residential
right.
loans.
Because they're trying to protect the consumer, not the corporations.
But for commercial loans, pretty much open,
Yeah.
you know.
Open season.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So, how much do we want our loan origination fee to be? We want it to be 2%?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so loan origination fee. %2 of loan amount. Okay, so in this case, $7 million times 2%. $140,000 is our loan origination fee.
Nice.
Are you the lender?
All right. Are we good with that? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. You're good with it unless you pay it. Okay.
Right.
All right. So that's our loan origination fee. So the way to then think about this, as I was just explaining, was that you're really saying, take that $7 million, subtract out the $140,000, so your net proceeds are really $6,860,000.
Net proceeds in terms of like at the origination, that's what you would
Right.
actually have.
Now, here's what you want to do. So you're going to take that amount, 6860, put that in as your present value. All right. Then,
Are you borrowing 7 million or are you borrowing?
this is, okay, give me a chance to explain. All right, so you're going to put that in, and then initially, let's just solve for the interest rate to see what happens just doing just that.
So we're just changing the PV.
No, not clearing anything out, just changing.
5.75.
Okay. Do it myself real quick, make sure I don't. So we've got 5.75 rounded. Okay. Now, so to kind of get to Alex's point or question or observation. So what's really happening, we still owe the lender, even though we're changing this to this 6.8 million, we still are having to pay back the lender the full 7 million. Okay? It's just that we're subtracting that out of the original amount because that is sort of our net in terms of what we're really receiving from the lender. Okay? After the transaction, like I was talking about earlier. Once again, when I said, I give you 100,000, you give me 2,000 back, the net is 98,000. In this case, the net is 6.86 million.
So you're not paying interest on the 140,000?
No, you are. You're paying interest on the full 7 million. Okay? So here's what's happening. Because of, from the lender's perspective is they're really getting a 5.75% rate of return on what they're really lending you by virtue of that loan origination fee. Okay, does everybody see that? Yes or no?
Seems like
Okay.
a little different.
It is, but this is it's how the lenders make extra money. You know, you get to feel sorry for them. They got to come up with ways to basically make some extra cash.
I have a loan origination fee.
So a loan with no origination fee will always be better than one with origination fees?
If the interest rates are the same, if the stated interest rates are the same.
Okay.
Okay, but see, here's the thing. If you remember what I said, you have the loan origination fees, you have the prepayment penalties, and you potentially have servicing fees. It's like a wicked brew that if you have one that has none of those, it's just a stated interest rate and has none of that other stuff, then all other things being equal, that's going to be the best loan. But the reality is, it usually doesn't work quite like that. They have some of those other pieces of the wicked brews thrown in there so that it does, you know, inflate the rate. If they don't make the money off the front end, they're gonna make it off the back end, or they're gonna make it off the middle. Or all three.
That just seems so extravagant. Like people like are okay with that. Like nobody in the dawn of time when they came to them was like, that's bullshit, and just like nobody like everyone's like, that sounds great, and just kept the cycle going.
Clearly you're not a lender.
I guess so.
Do you
Like,
get any tax benefits of being a lender?
In what way?
Like depreciation or anything like that?
No, not off of the asset, no. I mean, unless like you own an asset.
But yeah, without owning, because like, as a real estate investor, I mean, like, this is honestly like very appealing, because you don't do much work, so you're underwriting and lending out money.
Right. You're basically mailbox money.
Yeah.
Okay. Now. Okay. Now here's the part. This is the part that makes Chase's head explode. Okay. This next little piece. So what happens? Now see, this is making the assumption that we do what? That we hold this loan for how many years?
20 years.
20 years. But we're not going to hold the loan, or the lender is not going to hold the loan for 20 years. How long are they going to hold it?
5.
5. Huh. What does that mean?
The interest rate is higher.
That this is going to be higher because, in essence, what we're really doing in this scenario is we're amortizing that $140,000 over 20 years.
Right.
But now, if we say the lender's only getting the benefit from it for 5 years, because, in other words, remember what I said? After 5 years, what are you going to do? You're going to pay refinance, you're going to charge you another loan origination fee. Yes? And then another one, another 5 years later, and then another one, another 5 years later. Okay? So the point is, the next piece of this is we got to figure out what the balance is on the loan after 5 years, put that in as the future value, put the term as 60 months, leave this as our present value, and then solve for the interest rate and see what happens. It's going to go up. Simple. I'm cutting to the chase. Okay? Literally.
Connor, if you want to borrow money, talk to me, bro. I got the origination fees in the class.
so the overall takeaway is be the lender.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Always be the lender.
All right.
Just go source cheap capital and lend it out a little bit.
Yeah. It's all, yeah, exactly. Okay. All
You
right,
get
so
tough guy insurance.
let's just say, all right. So at this point, what we could do is, all right, let's cross out these for a second. All right. We're going to have to start all over. All right.
Change to 7 million, right?
You could, let's do that. Well, what the heck? But anyway, but there's just, okay. Anyway, start all over. One, input, 60.
Are we restarting or not restarting?
Either way, okay, you can,
Let's restart.
Agreed.
I think we should replace this one.
well, there's nothing that's going to change as an issue of restarting. I mean, okay, it needs to erase those. Okay. All right. So, one, input, 60. Shift, amortize, equal, equal, equal. Get our balance. Hold on. You get.
Because he's doing it on the 6.8. It's not doing it on the 7.
Okay. So we get that. One input, 60, shift, amortize, equal, equal, equal. All right. So our balance is going to be 5,893,169.33. Okay. So what you're going to do is you're going to make that the negative future value. You're going to make the term 60. And then you're going to put in the 6860 as your present value. And then you're you're gonna solve for the interest rate, or the lender's yield. Obviously, you can round that up to 6%. So,
And this is prepaid at 5 years? Is that-
prepaid at 5 years, okay? So, the original loan, this is put things in perspective, original loan, stated interest rate, 5.5%. If we held the loan for the full 20 years, the effect of the prepayment raised it to a 5.75%. But because we're paying it off after only a 5-year term, then the actual cost of the loan with the prepayment penalty is basically 6%, okay? So what we thought was, once again, a 5.5% interest rate loan really is a 6% interest rate loan. But that's just with the loan origination fee. Now if we throw in the prepayment penalty, we throw in, the other stuff, it's gonna be even worse. Okay, make sense?
Can you scroll back up a little bit? We can maybe dissect it. So what you're saying is start off with a $7 million, oh my. A $7 million loan, like you said, stated 5.5%. We solve for the payment completely without worrying about the prepayment penalty beforehand. And then after finding the payment off to the side, figure out what the after prepayment present value is.
No, not
No,
prepayment.
it's future value.
It'd be after the origination.
This is the future value, the payoff amount. Then after we've done all that, then we put in the adjusted future value because this is going to be discounted by virtue of the $140,000. We can't do that prior to that because the loan is still based off of the $7 million.
Gotcha. So in order to get the amortized balance at the end of year 5, you can't adjust anything.
Correct.
Gotcha. And then 60N is 5 years.
Yes. It's logic. It's just okay. All right.
What if you're creative?
What? All right. So now, okay, that's what we have to do for the quiz.
So that future
For
value
today.
is based on the 7 million, not on that 6.
This is, yes, this payment and this payoff are based on the 7 million. But we have to make an adjustment to that after we've done those calculations to adjust for the 140,000 that we basically paid in the loan origination fee. Okay?
This may be redundant, so after you get your new future value, on the calculator, what do you do after that to get the 5.99%?
All you're really following this set of keystrokes. You put this in as your future value.
Correct.
You put this in as your new term of 60 months or 5 years. Put in the present value based upon the
Loan amount.
the adjusted loan amount, the loan proceeds, and then solve for the interest rate.
Thank you.
I'm just trying to think of the 5.75%. So that was for.
That would be assuming that you held the loan for the entire 20 years.
Yeah, that's if you were like.
This is only holding the loan for 5 years. Okay?
Because that's your balance after 5 years.
And this is how you find out buyer's yield too, to see.
It's the same thing. It's lender's yield or the effective cost of borrowing for the borrower.
When the cash flow of the business.
Okay? Okay. All right, so that's what you need to know for today for the quiz. Okay? We've covered all of that. Now, let's cover some much more interesting stuff. Okay.
Much more interesting stuff.
Well, I'm not saying that it won't be covered in a future quiz, but we're just going to go ahead and talk about it now. Okay? While your brain is still in rapid fire mode.
In emotion.
Okay. So let's try to do this. Let's create something a bit more exotic. So we're going to have a prepayment penalty a loan origination fee.
A service. You're just tagging on.
And then a servicing fee. Now let's see if we can kind of work through this. So first of all, let's just start off. So what percent do we want the prepayment penalty to be?
2.5.
2.5. What percent do we want the loan origination fee to be?
Let's go 1.75.
No, 3%.
3%. What the heck? Okay, now then, the servicing fee. Normally we're going to do this as a dollar amount. So we could do it as a percentage of the loan amount, but either way, it doesn't really matter. But we want, basically this is for cashing the check, posting the check, that sort of thing. So just
Annually or rent?
$300 a month?
usually per month.
Per month, let's say $75.
Okay. Okay, so go back over here. 12 payments per year. Okay, now what are we going to pay off the loan? And in what year or month?
This is the early payment?
There's going to be an early payment. So somewhere before, let's say
7.
well, before 5 years.
Oh,
7 months.
48 months.
A month 3.
Month 3?
This is quick.
You're balling.
It's a quick.
You got that loan 2 months in, your business so successful.
Quick flip.
Okay, pay off at end of month what?
48.
Okay, that's it for 4 years. Okay. All right.
Alec got the loan, met the plug.
All right, so let's just say this one, we're going to make the dollar amount small, $100,000. Okay, and we'll say that the loan amortization period is 25 years. So 25, shift in, okay. And our stated interest rate is what? 5%? Okay? All right. So now we've got all the elements we need to be able to do the problem. All right? So the first thing, get our payment. Start with that. Okay? So far, so good. Phase 1. Okay? Okay? Now, so let's do this. Let's find out the balance at the end of month 48. Okay? $91,097.56. Okay? Everybody still with me? No one has been lost yet. Okay. Now, so what we're going to do, we're going to start, and we're going to go ahead and apply the prepayment penalty. So the prepayment penalty, to keep things simple, we're going to make it 1.025 to multiply it by itself plus the 2.5%. Hit equal.
93,374.
Okay, let's just say times 1.025. Okay, I get 93,375 and 00. Okay, everybody still with me? Okay. Make that a negative future value. Okay. Okay. Now then, Next step is we're going to add on $75 a month to our monthly payment for the servicing fee. Okay, so what you're going to do the math, we're going to take, just type in 584.59, just pulling down from up here, plus 75 equals, get that amount. Don't clear everything out, just follow what I'm doing. So we get 659.59. We're going to put that in as a negative payment amount. Okay. Then we have our loan origination fee that we need to deal with. Okay. The loan origination, basically we take that 100,000 and we're really just going to be slicing off what? 3%, yes? Yes?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we can do that a couple of different ways. We could just simply say times 100 minus 97, which would be 3%, or 100 minus 3%, which would be 97%, or 0.97. In other words, what we're saying is 100 minus 2%, or I'm sorry, 3%. Okay, 0.97.
What is this line again?
This is for our loan origination fee. So we end up with 97,000 is what we're netting as our present value. Okay. $3,000 for the loan origination fee. Okay. Then the final piece, 48 months as our term. Then solve for the interest rate for the lender's yield. Okay, what do we end up with?
735.
Pretty cool, huh? So, once again, what we thought was, hello, come on, give me that power. What we thought was a 5% loan ended up being a 7.35% loan because of the loan origination fee, the prepayment penalty fee, and the servicing fee. Make sense? Now,
How did we put the payment right here? You just, after you put the future payment, you just push payment back, or you just typed in the payment push back?
you follow it exactly as I have it written.
So you would go future payment, then that number?
You mean future value?
Future value, I'm sorry, yeah, future value, but after that line,
Then you just type this in, plus that equals that, change sign, payment.
okay.
Just like a quick calculator thing. So when I put it in, I changed the payment, did 659.59 payment, and it didn't quite come up as like the usual where like a bunch of zeros. So I clicked it again, and then it comes up with like a different number. And so
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
yeah, I was gonna say, so like if you click payment again and there's
Yeah.
nothing in there, it somehow like changes it. Like
Yeah, you don't want to do that.
okay, that's
Okay,
strange.
now, would you, okay, how much time do we have? All right. I could show you how to do this in Excel real quick. No? Yes?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay.
Probably won't see it in the monitor.
I'll time it in Excel.
Shots fired.
I was thinking, we probably don't have time.
Yo.
No, because I mean, by the time I go through everything, yeah, you need,
Integrated
you need,
finance.
okay, so let's talk a little bit about the test.
Like substituting.
All right. All right, so I passed around a sign-up sheet. Oops, that's not it. Where are the two sign-up sheets for the test? There's one up there, there's another. Okay. So, as I said, some of you aren't going to make that decision until after you obviously take the quiz today as to whether or not you're going to sign up to take the test sometime this next week. Now, the way that the test will work, I'm going to tell all this up front. The test will be 40 questions. Now, imagine that. You have 4 quizzes, 10 questions on each quiz. So 4 quizzes together, 40 questions. No.
Will we at least get the other test back so that we can study?
Absolutely not.
So the way that it works, you know what the topics are. You've been given the topics. Okay. You've written down examples in your notes as to what the types of questions are.
All the videos are on YouTube.
You've got all the videos on YouTube. All right. So all you need to do is basically go back, review all of that, and make sure that you obviously know how to do the calculations and so forth. But now, here's the thing, as I've said, it is closed book, it is closed notes, only your calculator. So that means you got to know it. Because what takes so much time with these quizzes is the fact that you're just going back to your notes and trying to basically learn it from your notes to do it on the quiz. What you have to do to make that transition for the test is you've got to go back to your notes, you've got to really learn it now and get it hard pressed in your memory as to what to do. And as you know, it's not about just pushing buttons on the calculator. You've got to understand the logic of what's being asked to be able to go through the process. Okay? Now, my experience in the past has been all over the map as to what happens with people whenever they take the midterm versus their quizzes. I have had people who have literally failed every single quiz come in and ace the midterm. Okay? But I've also had just the opposite. I've had people that have done pretty well on the quizzes, get sort of overconfident and cocky, come into the midterm and fail in. What do? I take the higher of the two, okay? So there's no penalty to taking the midterm, okay, if you do poorly, except for your time and effort to obviously go through that brain damage. But outside of that, you've got the opportunity to stick with whatever your quiz grades are. Now, you have to make the decision today whether or not, and it's after you take the quiz, obviously, and get your grade for the quiz for today, and you see what your current average is on those first 4 quizzes, but you have to make the decision today, are you taking the quiz, or the midterm, or are you not? If you are, then you must sign up one of these time slots that I've allocated on Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday of next week, and then you be given 2 hours to complete. So it's basically 30 minutes per section or per quiz. Okay? Does that make sense? So yes, you've been given, I think the first day you were given about 45 minutes, you're given like an hour, you're given like an hour, and now another hour to basically do these quizzes. So you've got to cut that time in half. Okay? And you've got to, it's not impossible, because in essence what we're saying is that for each question, you've got 3 minutes. That's more than enough to be able to do these. Because believe it or not, what I do whenever you're taking your quizzes, I do these, I'm done in less than 5 minutes, okay, for all 10 questions. Okay?
Rub it in.
So the point is, there is no reason mechanically you cannot do it in, obviously, 6 times that amount of time, is what I'm saying, okay? All right? So my point is 30 minutes is more than enough time to be able to do these if you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, you're never going to, you can sit there and agonize over what you're doing forever, okay? So the point is you need to know what you're doing, you need to allocate your time wisely, allocate 3 minutes per question, and get it done. It's as simple as that.
Are there practice questions in the textbook?
No. You have all the practice questions you need off of the notes, off of everything we've done in class. Okay, simple as that. I'm not trying to be, anything other than I've given you everything you need to be successful. Okay? And at this point, it's really up to you.
Right.
Okay? All right. So, that being said, I've got the sign-up sheets up here. I'm going to put them up here so that you can, after you get your quiz scored, you can sign up on one of those if you choose that you need to. Otherwise, pretty much good to go.
Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate
Let's
that.
get it.
I don't know if I could just carry you.
Don't click the beginning and end.
Yeah, okay. Anybody's calculator still set on begin-end mode? I hope not. Otherwise, today you've probably been really struggling. Oh, no. You wanted it off, okay? Is not. Okay, all right, are you ready? What?
Quick back.
You need a quick bathroom break or not? Yeah. Okay, go. Take a quick bathroom break.
So the real estate investment trust question.
Says it all.
This is in another.
It will be whatever I provide you with. That's all I can say. Huh? I've already awarded all that.
Alright.
Well, no, you got 10 points last week for just showing up to the speakers.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
But if you do have an this is your loan amount, payment, this is your future levy, this is your utilities, and then but avoid comparing that. No, that's your, yeah, for the sorry. And then like if all the stuff, just go through this data.
That's not good baseline. $100. I got other hobbies.